After 12 years of being excluded, they suddenly showed up at my luxury home on Christmas. The front door swung open and the sound of the ocean filled the hallway, like a memory arriving before the people did. Outside, the sky was a clean winter slate. Inside, the house smelled faintly of citrus and pine, an attempt at holiday restraint against a life spent once masking loneliness with baking. Eleanor stood on the threshold, her coat clutched at her throat, Gregory beside her with his hands jammed into his pockets, as if they needed to hide. They looked at the leather sofa as if measuring whether it belonged to the woman they used to know. For a moment, I only watched them, watched how their eyes shifted from the Italian leather to the art on the wall, how their fingers adjusted the collar of two thin coats, how their mouths practiced regret like a rehearsed line. They had the tired, slightly dazed look of people who'd been walking a long way and suddenly realized they had lost the map. The house had not always been like this. 12 years ago, 12 years of missing birthdays, empty chairs at holiday tables, and unanswered calls. There was a small kitchen that held the world for me. The counter was scarred, the table wobbled, and the oven still remembered the heat of 100 pies. That kitchen taught me how to make a life one loaf at a time. I could tell you, with the kind of certainty that lives in scent, that cinnamon binds people together, that the smell of butter browning is its own kind of comfort, that the warmth of a fresh pie can make a Monday feel like home. Eleanor used to stand on a stool by that counter, flour on her nose, colliding into broom handles and giving me the kind of affection that felt like sunlight. She learned, as children do, how to fold crusts without looking, how to press the seams of a pie like sealing a promise. We were small and noisy and alive. That life did not require a seaside view. It required hands and recipes and a willingness to stay. We had that once. Then the absence arrived like a small repeating bruise. Invitations that never got returned. Phone calls that died mid-sentence. "We can't make it" became a refrain that stacked up into a wall. At first, I told myself life happens. Babies, work, travel. I told myself in the afternoons while kneading dough that love can tolerate distance. That distance stretched and then hardened. Their absences found names. Weddings I wasn't invited to. Graduations attended but watched from a screen. Holidays where my chair was mentioned as saved and then sat empty. I remember the Tuesday it finally cracked. It was raining so hard the street outside shimmered with a kind of grief. Eleanor called, and at first her voice was the same thin, familiar thread. Then Gregory spoke, polite at first, the kind of politeness that sits on top of a blade.
He suggested we needed space, that things would be simpler if we had fewer overlapping holidays, fewer obligations, that my needs somehow made them uncomfortable. They framed my love as a burden. They reframed my attempts to participate as interference. Do you know the particular ache of being told you are too much? It sunk in, slow as syrup. They didn't march me out. They rewrote the story. My calling became clinginess. My concern became overbearing. My invitations became intrusions. Words did the work. Other people stood by and let grammar turn the map. In the months that followed, I watched my role shrink on their stage. "It's not personal," Gregory said, as if isolation could be sanitized. Martha came by that afternoon when the rain finally eased. Martha, the woman from the corner with the shawl that always smelled of lavender, sat at my table and took my flowery hands and said, "They chose a new life, that's all." Her voice, practical and soft, was the first thing that did not try to press the pieces back into what they had been. "You can mourn," she said, "but you don't have to live on that mourn." She was the one who taught me to vend at the farmer's market, who folded $70 bills and small talk with equal care, who handed me a canvas apron and said, "We'll sell pies, we'll make the world taste better." So I made pies. I sold them under a battered awning every Saturday, steaming jars of apple and pecan and lemon, tucking notes into the boxes for a quick smile or heat for 8 minutes, and watching strangers come back because my crust had a way of staying soft under the teeth, but holding the whole. The market taught me another vocabulary, resilience, which is different from grit. It is the ability to be useful and still expect warmth. There were small rescues along the way. Mr. Peterson, who owned the bakery across the lane and liked to call me the lady with the steady hands, introduced me to the woman who ran the coffee cart. Martha, who of all the people in the town had the deepest pockets of empathy, brought casseroles and an ear. Women in the market learned my story in slices and bites. They brought me jars of jam and the kind of gossip that made me feel like I was still someplace in the world. Little by little, friends became a map. And then, in a way that felt as improbable as a summer cardinals in December, Aunt Joan's name came back into my life. She was the aunt who had always sent cards with too much handwriting. She was the woman who kept a china teacup for reasons no one else could recall. She had been careful, private, the kind who kept a little safe under the floorboards and never told anyone about it because she could not imagine the world would need to know. When she died, the town whispered that she'd left something for me. I thought it would be a teacup or a shawl. She had other plans. The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and old paper. He slid an envelope across the table with the kind of formality that makes small things huge. "Your aunt wanted you to have it," he said, as if this explained everything. The letter inside was her handwriting, mottled and patient, and it was full of an odd, tender clarity, recognition of the woman I had been, a recounting of a crumble of pies as if that were a lifetime, an apology for not being braver in her day. She left me money, more money than I knew what to do with, but it was never the money, not truly. It was the recognition. It was someone naming that my life had been worth marking. With that money, I made a choice I had not allowed myself to make before. I wanted a home where the light met the sea and the wind could carry away the old smallness. I wanted a place with a large window where I could watch tides and not have my chest tighten with the urge to wait for the phone. I bought the house in cash, walked through the rooms, and understood for the first time that wealth, when it arrives late, is not magic, it's permission. Permission to choose who you let in. Permission to keep your dignity intact without explanation. Do not misunderstand me. I did not build a fortress. I kept the kitchen small and useful because cinnamon and butter still work on the soul. I bought a chair for reading that let my back relax and a work table that did not wobble. I hung the painting of the harbor because the harbor is honest. It takes in boats and it lets them go. The house was a statement less about show than about selectivity. I could, finally, decide what hospitality meant for me. People noticed. In the market, there were new conversations, soft ones that began with, "Have you seen Annabelle's new place?" Mr. Peterson waxed a little poetic about how you could tell she had earned the quiet that comes when a life gets pieced back together. Martha brought the neighbors for tea and said, "Let's christen the house with proper buns," and I laughed because it felt strange to be christened at 58. The town did what small towns do best. They folded me back into themselves in the way they knew how, with casseroles and lawn chairs and a chorus of small kindnesses. Time did not make me forget. I still had nights where I woke with the sound of a chair scraping in an empty dining room, where the thought of an empty plate brought a physical ache. But the ache had a contour now. It was framed by a place where I could stand and say, quietly, "This is mine." It was a dignity purchased, but not at the expense of mercy. I did not want retribution. I wanted truth, and if there could be repair, it would take the steady work of genuine remorse. Back on that Christmas morning, the house glittered without being gaudy. The mantel held a few ornaments, each one placed with intention. The tree was trimmed in quiet colors, lights like small promises. I stood in the hall where the ocean talked in a low tide voice and watched as Eleanor and Gregory stepped inside, as if the front door were a page being turned on a chapter I had not known would return. "Mom," Eleanor said, and there it was, an old syllable with new weight. Her voice trembled in a way that belonged to someone who had been carrying a secret too long. She looked smaller than the last time I had seen her in person. Time and worry had thinned her face into a softer map of herself. Gregory's jaw was set, an attempt at control that had the brittle quality of a tight clasp. They did not come with garlands and warm hands. They came with explanations, with papers and whispers, and a map of losses that had, they said, become too big to carry alone. They spoke of bankruptcy, of an apartment that had been taken, of bills and sorrow and their children's faces and photographs that seemed perpetually frozen in a happier light. Eleanor's eyes kept darting to the photograph of Aunt Joan on the bookcase, like she was measuring whether she had a right to the name that had changed my life. I let them speak. Sometimes the generosity of listening is exactly the kind of test that reveals people's motives. In the kitchen, the oven hummed on. The scent of cloves and orange peel hung in the air. I had prepared nothing for them, not because I wanted to punish, but because I wanted clarity. The first part of Christmas is often illusion, plates that are perfect, laughter that is cued. I wanted none of that. I wanted truth. "You had 12 years, I said finally. The words fell simple and hard, like coins on a table. 12 years of silence, 12 Christmases I wondered if you were alive to me. The number landed between us with a weight that anyone who has ever been left behind would recognize. They looked away. Gregory shifted, and for an instant the town of small gestures I had built around myself seemed distant and tender at once. There was a pause, and in that pause I felt the press of the past. Sunday dinners missed, phone calls refused, excuses retooled into polite lies. I could list off the slights like a litany. The graduation where my presence was complicated, the the holiday where I will be in town turned into silence. But I also remembered small, luminous things. Eleanor's hand on the dough, the way she would hum under her breath when she was thinking, the scrape of a comb through her hair when she was nervous. Gregory cleared his throat. We weren't always in a place to ask for help, he said. The words were carefully chosen, like a man rearranging furniture in a room he doesn't own. There were decisions, bad ones. I made some mistakes. He spoke of pride, of losing pride, of the kind of poverty that is measured in both money and self-regard. Why now? I asked. It was not a mean question. It was a necessary one. People come back for many reasons: grief, guilt, necessity.
Some return because they finally see the cost of what they've done. Others come because they have nothing left to lose, and they hope mercy comes with old names. You learn to read the air around apologies. Eleanor's hands twisted together, small, anxious knots. She began, and then stopped, searching for the right grammar of remorse. There are words that do not exist for all kinds of harm. We need help, she finished, and the simplicity of that sentence made my skin prickle. Need is neighbor to shame. That was when Martha stepped into the doorway. I had not told her anything. She simply arrived like a tide you expect but cannot always name the hour of. She came with a casserole dish in one hand, and the look of someone who had decided the world would not be allowed to go on without making a small, sensible noise. She set the casserole down and nodded once at Eleanor, and within that nod was all the tenderness and the judgment that a friend can give, an assertion that I am not alone, that the town is watching, that kinship has moved beyond blood. If you like true life reckonings like this, if you find the slow violence of exclusion and the sharpness of reclaiming dignity compelling, subscribe for more stories that hold both pain and quiet triumph. I only ask because people will ask what they would do in my place, and because there are others whose stories are knotted in the same way. They sat at my kitchen table then. The light from the window lay across their coats and onto the wood. The ocean murmured like someone trying to remember a hymn. For a time the room was full of small domestic noises, the kettle's soft whistle, the scrape of a chair. And then Gregory unfolded the first of the documents he carried, a stack of papers that looked like the anatomy of their misfortune. "I'm not asking for pity," he said. "I'm asking for help." He spoke in a tone that tried to preempt judgment, like someone who wants to apologize but fears the punishment will be louder than any plea. He explained the debts, the calls from collectors that had begun, the vehicle they had lost. He painted a picture of a life that had unstitched itself, and he appealed to the history we had shared, as if the years of bread and birthday candles could be a currency to redeem their present. Eleanor did not look at me when she spoke. Her voice was thinner now, sharpened by remorse. "I remember the pies," she said quietly, a sentence that felt like a prayer and a confession. "I remember the kitchen. I'm sorry." The apology landed like a small bird, fragile and apologetic for its forwardness. "Why did you let it go so long?" I asked. The question was not cruel. It was the precise lever that I needed to understand whether this was repentance or a rescue-seeking dressed as penance. People can say they're sorry, but what matters is why they waited until something else had collapsed. Gregory's answer had a rehearsed cadence. "We thought we could fix it ourselves," he said.
"We didn't want to burden you." The sentence was familiar, the kind of thing people say when they want to frame their absence as protection. But absence framed as protection is often a mirror for control. He continued, and in his account there were familiar manipulative patterns. "We're fixing it, we're protecting the children from trauma, we're saving you from being involved." His words attempted to flip the story, make their choice to step away into an act of service rather than an act of erasure. I had time to study the lines of his face. Control leaves traces, tightness at the jaw, a way of watching others like people are chess pieces. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved like a woman who had been taught to trust the adult who was always right. She had the look of someone whose inner compass had been replaced by another's voice. It made me ache in that wise old way, for the daughter I had known and for the woman she might yet become. When their explanation began to smell like an outline for a rescue, I stopped them. "If you want reconciliation," I said, "then tell me how it started. I want the truth. Not pity, not theatrics, truth." The demand for truth is not dramatic, it's a practical thing. Mercy without truth is a house built on sand. They looked at each other, and in that glance I saw fear and the first reluctant slip of responsibility. "Gregory told me that you expected too much," Eleanor murmured, the voice of a woman repeating what she had been told. "He said you were suffocating the kids. He said you used guilt." There it was, the mechanism. Reframing love as guilt, presence as suffocation, concern as interference. The words had been used to erode, grain by grain, the basis of our relationship. Gregory added, less smoothly, that he'd become their protector, that outsiders often misread his intentions. He framed his control as guardianship. He called the boundaries he put in place necessary for their family's peace, as if peace can be manufactured by excluding the people who love you. I listened until their excuses had run their course. Listening is a tool. It sharpens what is true and exposes what is performance. And then I asked for specific details. The first unreturned invitation, the moment when their calendar turned into a barrier, the particular phrases used to reframe my efforts as interference. They gave them, and their answers painted a quiet picture of manipulation. Little edits to the story that added up over time, small gaslights, gentle reframings that made my presence a problem. It is astonishing how slow cruelty can be when it is dressed in concern. The real cruelty is not a single violent act, but a series of tiny revisions to a life, 1,000 small it's complicateds that become an invisible wall. Gregory had built that wall piece by piece, and Eleanor, for reasons both immaterial and deep, had stepped behind it.
"Why did you let him?" I began, and then paused, because sometimes the obvious questions are crueler than the truth. Eleanor's hands moved like they were trying to catch a falling thing. "I was scared," she said simply. There was no deflection, no pretense. Fear explained a lot. Fear explains compliance, and fear changes a person's map. It did not excuse what had been done, but it explained the human carriage beneath the actions. At that point, the conversation turned quieter. They spoke of therapy attempted and half done, of promises to change that never had the follow-through, of small relapses into old power patterns. There was a childlike part of me that wanted to lay out a table and set a warm plate before them to make up all the years with a single afternoon. But reality does not stitch like that. Years of absence are not healed by casseroles and an apology. They are reconciled by truth, consistent change, and work that is unromantic and ongoing. They asked for my help then, in a way that was both blunt and oddly pleading. The ask was framed as, "We need a place to stay while we get back on our feet." They spoke of vulnerability and children, of Christmases where they had to choose what to keep. I could see the exhaustion rooted in their faces. They had been through storms. My heart, for all its armor, softened in a way that would have gotten me into trouble once. But I had learned to test intentions before charity. I had spent long winters learning the difference between rescue and repair. Repair wanted to make amends and build new bridges. Rescue wanted a quick fix so the old patterns could remain intact. I had seen enough of the latter to know where it led, back into the same circling. "I will not be your emergency landing pad," I said. The words felt harsh as I uttered them, but they were precise. You can be generous and still have limits. There is a dignity in refusing to be the solution to someone's repeated choices. The house was not a bank for their repentance. It was my home, a place I earned the right to keep whole. Eleanor looked hurt in a way that was real, not performative. "Please," she whispered. The plea, soft and earnest, stung me because it was the kind of thing I used to yield to without thought. I could imagine her small, young, and hungry again, reaching for me. I could imagine a dozen Christmases where forgiveness would have been simple and quick, and perhaps naive. And how many times before had forgiveness been assumed to be a currency? Too many. They spread out other things then, papers, the geometry of their misfortune, and told a story that began to look less like an appeal and more like a ledger. They listed debts and losses and the fog of a life that had been mismanaged. They did not yet put a number on the ask. They hovered near it like someone hovering over a threshold, measuring whether stepping across would be allowed.
I stood at the island and held a mug of tea that had grown cool, the steam a small, insistent ghost. I thought of Aunt Joan's letter and how recognition can be a powerful thing. I thought of Martha and the market and the women who shed what they could and kept the rest. I thought of dignity and what it means to keep yours in place and not trade it for the temporary balm of being needed again. In that moment, the tide outside moved in, a low, nearly imperceptible change. The house seemed to inhale and hold itself steady. I had to decide, was this a beginning of repair or the first move of a well-practiced claim? I did not yet know. I wanted to know. Truth must come before help.
Tell me the truth, I said at last. Not why you were forced into it by life. Tell me who made the choices. Tell me when you decided to let them rewrite you out. There was a small quiet in the room then, like a held breath. They exchanged a look, and Gregory's face tightened in that particular way of a man who has built scaffolding around himself and is not used to it being taken down. Eleanor spoke first. He said you couldn't understand, she murmured, naming the one who had said it. He said you would make everything about guilt. He said the kids needed a calm home, that we needed to protect them from the drama. She looked down. I believed him. Gregory's fingers tapped at the edge of the table. I was trying to protect the children from instability, he said, with the faint air of someone describing a strategy. He framed himself as a shield. He wanted to be seen as the one who had held a fragile family together. Protection, when wielded like a sword, becomes control. I watched them as the story fit together in the shards they offered. The narrative was familiar, a controlling partner who reframes closeness as instability, a child who learns to interpret love as obligation, a family that dissolves because one person decided what was best and the others folded around it. So you pulled away rather than fight, I said. You chose peace over presence. It was not a question of right or wrong anymore. It was a statement of fact, and facts are the beginning of any kind of repair. Eleanor nodded. Her eyes, for the first time that morning, looked directly at me. I'm sorry, she whispered, the apology finally not only at my feet but lodged somewhere in her ribcage where I could see it might stay. I am trying to find myself again. There was a long beat of silence. Outside, a gull made a harsh cry and then was gone. Inside, my living room kept its quiet, the kind that holds a house between storms. They had come back. They had asked for help. They had begun to tell the truth. I could have embraced them then, forgiven everything, set the table for reconciliation and call it a day. But years of being excluded had taught me that mercy without change is a loop. Mercy offered too soon can become a way to avoid consequences.
I would not be a prop in a story designed to let old patterns breathe. Before I could make a decision, Gregory reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. He placed it on the table with a certain ceremony, as if whatever was inside might sweeten the ask or soften the blow. Eleanor's hands hovered over it like a benediction. I looked at the envelope and realized I had reached the threshold that would tell me not only what they needed this Christmas, but what kind of people they were ready to be. The paper on the table sat like a hinge. The moment felt like the point before the tide turned. Their eyes were on me, mine were on them, and in that stretch of air, I felt the years, 12 of them, arranged like postcards I had kept in a box. Each one had a stamp and a small pane. Each one asked a question I was not yet ready to answer. He set the envelope down as if placing a verdict. It was ordinary stationery, the kind you might find in a drawer beside a stack of bills, creased, slightly soft at the corners. Eleanor rested her hand on it like someone wanting to bless an object and not the person who'd brought it. Gregory's fingers never left the rim of his coat pocket. There was a small animal tension in them, a readiness to withdraw or strike, depending on which the room offered. You don't have to open it, he said, but his voice was already edged with the thing he wanted me to do. Open, receive, unseal everything he could not afford to fix himself. My hands were steady. I picked the envelope up and held it by the fold, like a letter from the past or a small, dangerous bird. I slid the flap with my thumb. Inside were papers, notices, a column of numbers, a typed letter from a debt consolidation firm, and at the very top, a note in a hand I did not recognize. Gregory's explanation came out of him in short, polished sentences. We need $100,000, he said plainly, to clear what's pressing, to settle loans, to keep the kids from being... He could not finish without glancing at the photograph of a young face on my bookshelf, where Aunt Joan's picture made a small, dignified presence between two volumes. We can pay you back. There it was, currency offered as an apology, as the seal that would make all the messy things look clean. The number hung between us like a gauntlet, 100,000. It's a large number for anyone, and for someone who had built a life pie by pie, it was a landscape, not a sum. Why that exact amount? I asked. The kitchen felt smaller in that moment, the island a narrow stage. Asking for the arithmetic of a plea is not a cold thing. It is a hard, necessary kindness. If someone truly meant to change, they would have reasons that fit reality. If they were fishing for rescue, their numbers would be imprecise, their stories cloudy. Gregory's hands moved in a way I'd seen once before in courtrooms on television, calculated gestures meant to sell sincerity. It's the total to get us through.
catch up on mortgage arrears, medical bills, the lawyer fees from the foreclosure, he said. His mouth was trying to map out an inevitability so that I would feel collusion rather than consent. And where are your most immediate solutions? I pressed. Did you consult social services? Did you speak with the school about temporary support for the children? Did you sell anything you could part with? Ask family or friends? Or ask the bank for a plan? I wasn't interrogating to shame. I needed to know whether this number represented a thoughtful plan or a desperate attempt to paper over patterns. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the table. We tried, she whispered. She stopped, because the sentencing of that word, tried, meant they had not tried exhaustively, or they had tried in ways that preserved an old way of being, wanting someone else to make things right, without stepping into the discomfort of real change. Gregory's jaw hardened. We did what we could, he said, but the sentence was brittle. There was an avoidance to it, the familiar move of delegating responsibility to fate. You can speak plainly to me, I said. If you wanted me to be a bank, you could have said so. If you wanted me to be a stopgap while you rebuilt differently, say that. But I need to understand intent. Truth has a way of detaching kindly from half answers. I have watched people invent necessities when they meant convenience. He looked at Eleanor as if reading her like a ledger, then back at me, finally conceding a narrower confession. There were choices, he admitted. Bad choices. Some things were handled poorly. I misjudged what the kids would need, and I made decisions that I thought would protect them. That word protect kept circling. It had been the armor he'd used for years, protecting them from drama, from interference, from whatever nebulous threat of emotion he'd painted as danger. Protection turned into exclusion when it became unilateral. You cannot protect someone by denying them roots. And you told her to keep you out of ours, I said quietly, meaning the daughter who had been a child at my counter, but who had been trained by degrees to mistrust her own memory and the warmth she'd once known. Eleanor's mouth formed the shape of a plea. He said if we kept everyone at a distance, things would be calm for the children. He said you'd make them complicated, that your presence would upset them. I thought it was true. I watched her cry then, not the theatrical kind of tears meant to compel, but the small, late-invented ones of someone realizing the cost of co-signing silence. She pressed her forehead against her hands, and I could see the lines of exhaustion there, the places where second-guessing had become a habit. There, behind the shame and the pleading, was an ache I recognized as human, the ache of a person who had been made small by another's larger certainty. It wasn't true, I said.
It was not peaceful for me to be missing. It muddied the water for us all. You gave him the right to remake your life without inviting me into the work of it. Gregory bristled. We did what we thought best for our children, he repeated, and the sentence felt like an attempt to reroute accountability back into nobility. And now you want me to purchase a second chance for you? I asked. The question was the hinge. It laid bare the choice. Would I become a safety net that allowed behavior to continue, or would I insist on a repair that included acknowledgement and sustained effort? Mercy can be generous. It is not a license to repeat. He swallowed. We need time, he said. We can rebuild, but we need a foundation to get on our feet. I thought you being the one to help would be right. Your family. Your family. I have lived inside that phrase. It can be a comfort and a command. It had been wielded like a rope around my neck for 12 Christmases, a binding that said I exist largely to be summoned when convenient. All right, I told them. Say I had the money. Say I opened a bank and made a transfer. What happens after? Do you move into a plan? Do you work with a counselor? What changes in motion can you point to that will prevent this exact thing from happening again? Now they were on the defensive. We would, Eleanor began, and Gregory interjected with a list. We would enroll in financial counseling, get a mediator for family boundaries, sign an agreement to commit to therapy. We would, he offered the words like clauses plucked from an instruction manual, but there was a certain emptiness to them. Words can be scaffolding. They can also be hollow if they are not fastened to action. You're asking me to credence your timeline on the virtue of your promises, I said. Promises are easy to assemble in a kitchen with a clock ticking at midnight. I have heard vows before that dissolved when the morning light came. If you want me to help, then start by proving that you can do the smaller things without me putting up the money. Show me you can attend the counseling you say you will.
Show me you can find a temporary placement that does not rely on my bank account. That is what I mean by truth. Eleanor's eyes met mine, and there was a small, terrifying hope in them. How do I show you that? She asked. It was not an accusation. It was an admission that the world she'd been living in had been narrow, and that the map to the other side might be partly unknown. I named it plainly. You show me by taking actions that have costs to you that are not just financial. You show me by sticking to them when it's hard. You show me by admitting the parts that were you, the parts that were him, and the ways you will not let what happened before happen again. If you are willing to be awkward and small and admit that you were wrong for a season, then the rest will follow.
Gregory's expression darkened, as if the idea that change must look like discipline offended him. It's notable how often control collapses when the cost is humility rather than money. For the man who wanted to be the one who made decisions, having to keep small, repetitive promises was like being asked to do manual labor with no applause. "You're turning this into a morality play," he snapped. "We are not looking to skirt accountability." "But you are looking for a shortcut," I said. "Money does not remake character. It buys time. It buys breathing room, yes, but it also buys the chance to go back into the very patterns that broke you. If your pattern is to delegate the hard work to someone else, I will not be your enabler." There was an ugly second in which his face hardened into something sharp and small. He reached for the envelope as if to take it back, to assert his own narrative by removing the object that proved how much he needed it. Eleanor put her hand over his, a small, instinctive restraint that read now like a woman trying to keep a large animal from panicking. "Please," she said again, "we have nowhere else to go. I don't know how to do this without some stability. The children." I felt the calendar of those 12 missed Christmases sweep through me like a current. The children, the weight of being a parent and also the one who had been absent. I cannot pretend that the faces of those young ones did not form a small, immediate pull in my chest. I have been a mother. I know the arithmetic of wanting safety for your children, even if it means bending to another's will. This was the exact instrument Gregory had used before, tender images as leverage. He had become skilled at turning obvious good, like protecting children, into a sword that carved away the older love the family had relied on. Protect from drama, protect from involvement, protect from me. I had seen the tool used for years. "You can ask the town," I said finally. "You can ask the school for referrals. You can apply for emergency assistance. You can sell what you can sell. You can enroll in programs that provide food and shelter for families in transition. I will not write a blank check. I will not replace the work you need to do with money." There was silence then, the house like a held breath. Martha, who had not left my side since she walked in with her casserole dish, placed her hand on my elbow. Without theatrics, she said, "I'll take Eleanor to the community center. There's a woman there who's helped 2 families set up a payment plan with landlords and who knows a caseworker who'll take a petition. I'll sit with the kids tomorrow and bring soup. We will help, but we won't buy your way out of your decisions." That was the moment when something shifted in the room. The community, my chosen family, was present in spirit and flesh. Their presence meant that I was not alone as a moral arbiter, not merely a gatekeeper of wealth.
Martha's intercession was practical, not sentimental. Food, connection, accountability. The market's kindness was not as dramatic as money, but it offered a sturdiness that a single check could not. Gregory's face tightened. "We didn't come to be judged in front of your friends," he said. The accusation tried to turn the context into shame, to cast the witnesses as judges rather than supports. "You came for money," I said. "You asked based on a relationship you eroded. You asked for an answer without offering the necessary work. There's no justice in that." Eleanor began to cry harder. Her shoulders shook. "I know," she said. "I'm so sorry. I thought I could fix it on my own, and then I was wrong. I was wrong to let him do this to us. I'm sorry." Hearing her say it, the voice small and true, was what I had hoped for, but not demanded. She had named the place of culpability and the place where the wound had grown. It was the first real piece of repair offered without the expectation of monetary closure. It mattered more than I expected. Gregory set his jaw and stood abruptly. In the sudden movement, he grabbed his coat and his hat and pushed past Martha at the doorway. "We'll go," he said.
The coat's rustle and the slamming of the door after him sounded like a book being closed. He left without looking back. Eleanor remained at the table, crumpled, a small figure between the kettle and the scattered papers. She looked like a person who had been tutored into a new grammar and was now unlearning it. She stood, came to me, and for a moment there was the daughter I had once known at my shoulder, hesitant and made apologetic by age and habit alike. "Can I?" she started, and then stopped. I have learned over the years that offers of closeness must be navigated with care. I cannot pirouette back into a place where my presence enables retreat, but I could not turn away someone who had, for the first time in 12 years, said the word I had waited to hear. I was wrong. "Do not ask me for restoration tonight," I said. "Restoration is a long table, and it must be set with care. Come to counseling. Let me see a record. Let me see consistent attendance. Let me see you follow through when it costs you something besides words." She nodded as if those things were both a relief and a trial. "I will," she promised. The way she said it was not the glitter of a new vow, but the small, sober sound of someone taking a first step. Martha took her hand and squeezed it, something practical and warm. "We'll get you in tomorrow," she said. "There's a woman at the center who runs a sliding scale therapy program. Bring the kids. I'll watch them while you meet with her. We'll sort food, help with small bills. We won't give you $100,000, but we'll help you find steady ground." That full, surprising combination, her apology and the town's willingness to help in non-monetary, accountable ways, made the moment feel like a hinge.
It did not close the past. It offered a way to begin an improbable mending. They left that afternoon with some food in a sack and a map of local services Martha had scribbled down on the back of a receipt. Eleanor hugged me in a way that said, very plainly, that she had not known how to find her way back until someone else pointed. She stayed long enough to fold and refold the idea of responsibility into herself, and then walked out into the winter light that had shifted from gray to a brittle blue. Gregory's absence after that felt like a punctuation mark. For a while, the town talked about the scene, low, practical conversations at the market stall, muffled in their kindness. Mr. Peterson brought me his own small offering, a tin of shortbread and the kind of look reserved for people who know they've seen a life turn. "You did the right thing," he told me, and didn't lean into gloating or vengeance. His voice was plain and careful. There were consequences, predictable and strange. Eleanor lost an opportunity at a job because her instability raised questions, yet that forced her to admit realities she'd been shuffling under the rug. She started with a counselor who ran group sessions for parents who had allowed relationships to morph into cages. She wept in those rooms and learned to say her needs without apology. The change was not immediate, but months later she texted me a short message. "I started therapy. I'm sorry. I understand more now." That message was small and ordinary, and it was everything. The town rallied in practical ways that made more of a difference to a household than a single sum of money ever could. Martha organized meals and took the children to the community center when Eleanor had meetings. A woman from the coffee cart brought a little more upright, the shape of her face a bit lighter. Change looked like small purchases kept to budget and a steady attendance at sessions. That is the kind of repair that lasts. For me, the consequences were different. I had to live with the choice I made not to give the money. There were nights when the decision sat with me like a stone, and I questioned if I had been too stern, if I had missed an opportunity to be merciful in the moment. But then there were mornings when I woke and the house felt intact, and not merely a showroom of false comfort. I would watch the sea and think of Aunt Joan's handwriting. Recognition, she had called it. I had been given, late, a recognition that allowed me to select the shape of my life. Money had given me permission, but it did not make me noble. It gave me a stage from which to practice the hard virtue of saying no to being needed in a way that undid me. Wealth, late in life, can teach restraint as keenly as it can teach indulgence.
The months that followed were filled with small rhythms that rebuilt my confidence in other ways. I returned to the market with a new set of pies, ginger and pear in the winter, plum in the late summer, recipes adjusted to a slower pace. The town's kindness came like a thread. Mr. Peterson would call to ask if I needed help shipping out jars for folks who wanted a taste of the seaside. Martha came by on Thursdays and sat at my kitchen table, knitting, bringing news of everyone's small repairs. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, we would sit in my window and watch boats tack in and out of the harbor, and our conversations would float around recipes and children and the ways we had all been taught to make do. There were small joys that came without apology. I learned to bake with different flour, to measure by intuition again. I found the old habit of writing notes and tucking them into the pie boxes for a sudden Tuesday that people seemed to love. Being useful without losing myself became a new currency. Bitmity had the peculiar property of deepening when you practiced boundaries kindly. Occasionally, Eleanor would come by for a cup of coffee and to hand over something small she'd mended herself, like a mug with a glued handle. We did not sit for hours at first. The visits were short, purposeful. She talked about therapy and a workshop on parenting that she'd attended. She had begun to place the responsibility where it belonged, on herself and on a system that could help her rebuild. Gregory did attempt to call me once, voice rough and conciliatory, though I kept the boundary and did not take his calls. Some things are mended with distance. Some are mended by the slow work of one person deciding to be better. I also learned that chosen family has a way of multiplying. Women at the market would bring recipes to trade, and sometimes we formed an impromptu circle at the back of the stall, a kindness exchange. We would find ways to help each other without fanfare, an extra quart of milk left on a doorstep, a babysitting swap. Those small acts of reciprocity felt like the true scaffolding of community, not headlines, not a dramatic check, but the daily, tender mechanisms that keep people afloat. There was a curious liberation in refusing to allow my house to be a repository for other people's consequences. The house remained a place of welcome, but welcome with terms. I hosted a small gathering one spring for women who had been estranged from their families for all sorts of reasons. We drank tea and shared stories, and the room hummed with a particular kind of solidarity that comes from people who have tended their own wounds and found other hands to hold. People asked me, sometimes in the market, what I would do if Eleanor asked for reconciliation with no preconditions. I would say then what I say now: forgiveness is possible, but not unconditional acceptance of patterns.
True reconciliation requires evidence of change, sustained over time, not a single emotional afternoon. It requires labor, therapy, accountability, daily acts that speak louder than one-off apologies. I would not be cruel. I would also not be a shortcut for someone's avoidance of consequence. Christmases after that were quieter. The house was still lit, but the light no longer dimmed with an anticipation of someone who might arrive and not stay. I baked for the market and for friends. I invited Martha and a few neighbors who had been the most faithful. We shared small plates and laughter that felt clean because it wasn't trying to paper over anything. And every so often, when the wind bore the salt of the sea and the sky had that particular clean cold that makes your face feel alive, I would walk the stretch of beach near my house. The sand kept the imprint of each footstep, and then, almost lazily, the tide erased it. The motion became a metaphor I liked. You make a mark, you walk, you allow the sea to take what it will, knowing that your next step makes its own trace. It's not perfect. It is, though, honest. There is one memory that visits me often: the way Eleanor once stood on the stool at my counter, flour on her nose, humming while she pinched the crust. In my mind's eye, she is always that child in moments of repair, unwilling to let a life be simplified into a single decision. I keep that image as a lodestar when judgment threatens to calcify into cruelty. The final note in this chapter, if chapters deserve such an archival word, was a quiet text 7 months after that Christmas. It read simply, "I'm still working. I'm in therapy 3 times a month. Gregory left. I am figuring out how to be whole." There were no promises, no pleas, just a sentence that felt like a report. It was not the full reconciliation I might have once conceived in a romanticized arc. It was, rather, the slow, sober unfolding of a person taking responsibility. I kept the message and replied with a line that was plain and true. "I see you. Keep doing the work. The door opens when the work is steady." It was not an invitation to erase the past, but it was a hand extended along a road that would require steady walking. What remains with me most is this: dignity is not purchased by money, nor is it a prize to be wielded against others. It is a practice. It is the small acts of refusing to be used in another's narrative of rescue. It is the market friends who bring casseroles and teach someone to balance a ledger. It is the neighbor who sits with a child and listens. It is the woman who learns to say no to a man who promises salvation if she will only be silent. We live in a world that often mistakes charity for responsibility. There is a grace in both, but they are not the same. One can be generous and still keep a boundary. One can be generous and demand change. And refusing the quick fix of a check, I learned that my resources could still be poured out in ways that ask for accountability.
time, recipes, referrals, presence that does not enable the patterns that harmed us. So when the doors swung open that Christmas and the tide of 12 years of absence came with them, asking for a number and for a pardon, I offered instead this: truth, witness, and a plan. That plan did not include $100,000. It included small, steady things: a commitment to therapy, the town's support, and the dignity that comes from making amends with costs attached that are borne by the ones who caused the harm, not by the ones who survived it. If you've ever been on one side of a broken family or the other, you know how complicated it gets. There are no simple endings. There are choices, consequences, and sometimes mercy that arrives on a timetable of its own choosing. I chose peace and clarity over being a prop in the continuation of someone else's cycle. It was not a grand gesture. It was a steady one. Now, when I set the table at Christmas, I set it with intention. I keep seats for those I love who are present and well, and I hold open a possibility for those who show sustained change, not for the quick spectacle of a check and a promise. That is a kind of freedom, a small, stubborn liberty fashioned from years when I had less and learned the cost of giving too much of what I needed to keep safe. Tell me, what would you have done if you were standing at my kitchen table that morning? Would you have given the money? Would you have opened the door wide and let them reclaim you with one act of generosity? Or would you have done what I did and demanded truth before mercy? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more stories of ordinary people wrestling with dignity and second chances, like and subscribe.